Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Let's wait until we get more participants in the room, and then I'll kick us off. Great. We have all of our panelists, so
I
maybe we
know,
can
just in
get
time
started.
delivery had a surprise thing. Excited to be here.
No worries. We haven't started yet, but so you're right on time. I'll go ahead and kick us off here, and hopefully some more folks trickle in. And please use the chat or the Q&A function if you have any questions or issues, and we can try to help sort that out. Ashanti is helping, you can see her in the chat there. She's helping manage questions that she'll forward on to us. So thank you for attending. This is our first webinar ever. Today, this event's going to be recorded and added to our website for reference later on. So feel free to share that with your networks once it's published. We appreciate your flexibility after needing to reschedule from last week. Unfortunately, we lost one panelist, but we're going to try to talk about what they do as well. My name is Kelly Fleming. I'm the director of the Institute for Transportation Decarbonization, or ITD for short. For those of you who are not familiar, we're an organization focused on mapping a path to zero emission in the transportation sector by 2050, including on-road, off-road, aviation, marine, and rail. You can find more information about ITD on our website, including our grant funding for academic research, our research analysis, and any other events that we have going on in the future. Today, specifically, we're going to discuss the state of heavy-duty transportation and the path to electrification, with a big focus on the EPA Phase 3 greenhouse gas rule. And I'm excited to introduce our speakers, who are all experts in this particular topic. So first, we have Dr. Shelley Francis. She is the co-founder of EV Noir and EV Hybrid Noir. EV Hybrid Noir is focused on accelerating equitable multimodal e-mobility solutions. They're the largest network of diverse EV owners and have thousands of members and chapters across the world. Dr. Francis is formerly faculty of medical schools. She's a public health expert and a transportation expert. And she was also a director at Georgia's Department of Public Health. And has taught and mentored at schools including Ohio State, Case Western, North Carolina, and Morehouse. She's been recognized by the Progressive Change Institute as a top leader in the environmental sector, and we're really excited to hear her perspective today. Next, we have Tricia Del Iacono, Head of Policy for CalSTART. Tricia oversees CalSTART's advocacy efforts across the organization for both state and federal policies. She spent the previous decade with Moms Clean Air Force and the Environmental Defense Fund, focusing on EV policy. CalSTART is a nonprofit that was founded in 1992. It works with its member companies to build a high-tech and clean transportation industry. And then we have Craig Siegel, who is the Vice President of Policy for Evergreen Action. Evergreen was founded in 2020, working to influence the national climate policy landscape, and they've done a really great job playing a pivotal role in passing the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA. Prior to coming to Evergreen, Craig served as Deputy Executive Officer for Mobile Sources and Incentives for the California Air Resources Board, or CARB. So he has lots of relevant experience in this precise rulemaking process. He has a decade of experience crafting and passing regulations for zero emission transportation systems and designing incentives to support that transition. He is also an advisor to the government of the Falkland Islands. So all of these experts have perspectives and experiences in accelerating the transition to zero emission heavy duty vehicles in the transportation sector. We've seen states like California pass stringent regulations to require an increasing percentage of heavy duty trucks to be zero emission by 2035. The EPA is currently considering a rule called the Phase 3 rule, which is what we're going to be talking a lot about today. And that would reduce emissions from heavy duty trucks by 31% below 1990 levels by 2050, which is short of the 100% goal laid out by the Biden administration. The EPA rule is performance-based, meaning rather than setting a sales mandate like California does, it sets a performance standard that can be analyzed and projected to zero emission vehicle sales, which is what we'll be referencing today. So we're going to discuss the importance of transitioning to zero emission heavy duty vehicles to start, and then the current state of the industry and what's possible in the Phase 3 rule that could make the biggest impact. And I'm quickly going to turn it over to Dr. Francis to discuss the impacts that heavy duty transportation system has on US public health outcomes and the reasons that those burdens of pollution from the heavy duty transportation sector are disproportionately burdening communities of color and communities that are underserved by our transportation system. So I'll turn it over to you now, Dr. Francis.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Kelly. So great to be here again this afternoon with everyone, and this morning, depending on where you are tuning in from. So as Dr. Kelly shared, I am one of the co-founders and managing partners of EV Noir, and we're a consultancy that works on electric, connected, shared, and autonomous mobility solutions for both the private and public sector. And so while I work within the transportation and mobility sector, as she shared, I have a special emphasis within the public health realm when I think about multimodal clean transportation. And so, of course, because of that background and experience, overall across our organizations, we approach our work from a public health lens, really seeking to better understand how the social determinants of health are intertwined with transportation and mobility. And so what that simply means is that we view mobility holistically and seek to understand how where one lives, works, plays, and dies impacts their health and well-being. So earlier this year, one of our partners, the American Lung Association, issued their annual State of the Air report. And what we see in this report was that they found significant exposure to particulate pollution, particularly unhealthy levels of ground level ozone air pollution and short-term spikes in particulate pollution across the country. So within the United States, what we see, and this is well documented, people of color are almost 4 times more likely than white people to live in a county with 3 failing air quality grades. So under-resourced and low-income communities often bear a disproportionate burden of transportation emissions because many of the transportation corridors and facilities are located in and around their neighborhood. Communities of color and low wealth communities, also rural communities, can face this challenge as well. They bear an especially undue burden of when it comes to fuel costs, as well as harmful pollution due to the decades of systemic marginalization. So when we start thinking about transportation emissions and how it has a disproportionate impact on these communities, it exacerbates environmental justice concerns and health disparities, and they're interconnected. And some of the reasons how this plays out is in the following ways, and I'll focus on a few areas. So proximity to pollution sources. So historically, communities of color have been subjected to discriminatory practices like redlining when it comes to housing, so that lends them to live near highways, industrial zones, death zones, as it's often called, and transportation hubs. So this proximity increases exposure to harmful emissions, as we highlighted a few moments ago, including particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, volatile organic compounds, which are emitted from vehicles and industrial activities, particularly heavy-duty trucks. When we start thinking about health disparities, this higher exposure to transportation emissions in these communities results in a number of negative health impacts. and risk. So residents face elevated exposure rates of respiratory illness, is asthma, cardiovascular diseases, as well as numerous cancers and other health issues compared to those who are able to live in wealthier or predominantly white communities. So limited access to healthcare facilities, so not having a medical home, also further compounds these health disparities. Other items or issues that are connected to this include environmental injustices, socioeconomic factors, and intersections inequality. So just to quickly highlight these three areas. So these communities that are disproportionately impacted by transportation emissions, they experience higher levels of pollution without corresponding access to the green spaces, the tree canopies, clean air, or adequate environmental protections. And additionally, the lack of political power and economic resources may prevent effective advocacy for environmental justice. When it comes to socioeconomic factors, economic disparities also contribute to these inequities that we see playing out in exposure. So lower income communities of color may lack the financial means to access cleaner transportation options, relying instead on older, more polluting vehicles. And this reliance also amplifies exposure to transportation-related emissions. And then finally, when you start thinking about the intersection of inequality, the impact of transportation emissions intersects with the broader social issues like systemic racism, income equality, and housing segregation. And so these intersections create this compounding effect, now intensifying the vulnerability of these communities to environmental and health risks. So that's why this conversation today and others are really critically important. It's really important that we address these disparities utilizing a holistic approach that involves both equitable urban planning, policies that are promoting clean transportation, increased access to healthcare and public health, community empowerment, and targeted environmental regulations. So by prioritizing environmental justice, policy, and mitigating transportation emissions, we can work towards a more equitable and healthier future for all communities. So stricter policies can certainly have a significant public health impact for overburden and communities that are disproportionately impacted by transportation emissions.
Thanks so much. That's really helpful background. And I think one of the goals today is to discuss how this phase 3 rulemaking and other regulations can help really push the envelope that is going to have a positive environmental justice outcome. And so I have some questions for you all. These questions will be somewhat targeted at each of you, but feel free to jump in on anything that you have to say regarding these questions to all of you. So I'm going to start with Craig. You spent some time working on California's Advanced Clean Truck Rule and Advanced Clean Fleet Rule. If possible, can you just give maybe two-sentence summary of those rules? And then I'm curious to hear how we've seen the potential that regulation like those can have on influencing technology deployment in California, and how you see the potential for that to happen at the federal level.
Sure. And I want to start by just, again, uplifting what Dr. Francis just had to say, which is that these trucking conversations can be, and many members of the industry want them to be, abstruse technical conversations. You know, how many plugs are there for which trucks? And what we're really talking about are big chunks of the country where the sky is gray from diesel exhaust and everyone's kids have asthma. So, you know, how do you fix that? What you need are clear standards to force what the industry is dragging its feet, but is slowly doing, which is a wholesale conversion to zero emission trucks, all the way to zero. So, you know, what we did in California some years ago, we passed the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, which set a path of increasing zero emission sales through to 2035. And just last year, we passed the Advanced Clean Fleets Rule, which sets a hard target of 100% zero emission trucks by 2036, and also starts turning over the biggest, most unjust fleets, things like the drayage fleet that poisons ports communities. That's in tandem with incentives, a major plan to build out charging infrastructure, and rules for diesel emitting trucks to crack down on them. And there are two headlines from that. The first is that the industry, after being rightly beaten up in the press by advocates, came to the table and agreed that they would meet those commitments by 2036, regardless of who sued. So the fact, for instance, that like some trucking associations in red states are trying to blow up those rules doesn't matter. That's locked in. And I think the question is going to be, will the Biden administration pick up the ball and run with it? And what we've seen in their proposed rule is a fairly weak rule. It doesn't do what it needs to do. And what we've said and what many members of Congress have said, as well as the state of California and many other leading states, is, hey, you have billions of dollars in IRA investments to help build out the infrastructure you need and sort of start the capital that private companies should invest in. You've got a Justice 40 commitment to communities that's really critical to decarbonize the system. And in Michael Regan, you have an EPA administrator who has said he's deeply committed to environmental justice. So I guess my hope, having run the California program, is that we see similar ambition from the federal government. We've built a really strong base for them through the states. Communities have been calling for action now for decades, really clearly and powerfully. And the question now, because that proposed rule probably goes into White House review within the week, is will they do what they need to do to align their funds and align their efforts and align the rest of the policy ecosystem to get a really strong rollout building on what California has done?
Thanks. Well, we can talk a little bit more about incentives. I quickly wanted to mention, you mentioned a drayage, and I just wanted to recognize that we unfortunately lost one of our panelists, Adam Browning, because of the reschedule. So I wanted to share what they're working on, which is building out charging depots around ports, specifically for electric drayage trucks. They operate as a trucking as a service company. So fleet operators can pay a monthly fee, which includes charging and maintenance around ports and drayage routes. And then Forum can also help with purchasing or leasing an electric truck. And all of those are in California, which helps those businesses comply with the mandates set forward in the ACT and the ACF. And I wanted to recognize that drayage, as you said, is a particularly suitable use case, but also has disproportionate, I guess, benefits in this case for the communities that are surrounding ports, which do tend to be underserved and overburdened communities because they are located around ports. And so the next question I had was somewhat related to how you ended, Craig, for Tricia, but feel free to chime in. The IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, has provided some of these tremendous incentives to help transition on-road vehicles to zero emission, including new tax credits for light duty and heavy duty trucks in the commercial clean fleet incentive, and then through charging incentives through the National Electric Vehicle Charging Infrastructure Plan and the Community and Fueling Infrastructure grants. So I was wondering, Tricia, what role you see regulation playing in accelerating the transition to zero emission trucks at the federal level, and how those regulations can complement the incentives that were passed in the IRA.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. And thanks for having me here, and huge appreciation for both Craig and Dr. Shelley Francis just for lending their expertise to this conversation. I think that, we're all in agreement here. The provisions and incentives that were included in both the Historic Inflation Reduction Act as well as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law will definitely, and we've already seen this, significantly benefit, the US EV market as a whole through advocating or allocating substantial funding for, the needed infrastructure, research and development, as well as on the light duty side, we're seeing the consumer incentives. Increased investment in charging infrastructure. I think many of us in this space are, echoing and some of what Craig noted in terms of the alignment with both, all of these incentives and ensuring that we are deploying additional investments in charging infrastructure, particularly for the medium heavy duty space, is critical. In addition to what we've already seen through IRA and BIL be deployed. I think as Craig noted, and what you just noted about Forum Mobility's investment in California, I think it's important to highlight just the way the regulations work and what we're seeing, and are likely about to see as more states adopt the provision that Craig talked about, the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule. The investments are being made in California because that's where the regulatory certainty is. And so when we're looking at the EPA rule, it's important to reflect back on the investments that are being made in California, and what we're about to see with all of the new states adopting ACT. The regulation definitely drives the market certainty, and you'll hear this, from various members of CalStarts and beyond, talking about the need for this market certainty on a national lens, what the EPA could provide, and matching it with the level of stringency that we're seeing across the states, or a stronger rule than what has been put forward from EPA, or as Craig noted, their preferred option. We really want to see the rule match the level of ambition that we're seeing in states, and match that in terms of the stringency. We definitely believe that the industry and the market will follow. What is missing is the regulatory certainty from the EPA at this moment.
Thanks so much. And I'm wondering, Craig, I know you're pretty familiar with some of the projections for these rules. If you could comment on the projected impact that the proposed EPA rule as written would have on sales and deployment versus what is already projected based on California's rulemaking that already exists, as well as already implemented policies.
Sure. And I guess the first thing I should say is, we need a federal rule in this administration, right? So I know there have been some voices calling for a delay on this. That's not where I'm at. I do think that they need to take the time and review to strengthen it. So just to give you a sense, California, as I've said, is sitting at 100% electrification for every class of trucks. And for those of our listeners who have made better life choices having folks in truck classes, that's from like the semi-tractors all the way down to sort of small delivery vehicles. EPA's rule does do some work in electrifying the smaller truck classes, but it's hanging out, depending on who you talk to, between a quarter and a third of the really heavy-duty trucks electrified by the early 2030s. Given that sort of a greenhouse gas metric rather than a sales metric, reasonable minds can differ. That's really low. All the big industry players have rhetorically committed to electrifying their fleets completely or nearly completely in the major markets. The EU per ICCT is hanging out around 80% standards. And as I said, California and states that follow its rules, which is like a quarter of the nation's markets, is already at 100%. So what that means is that if EPA doesn't do more, it's basically putting a floor about it what states and companies have already committed to, and is significantly behind other markets, not just in the EU, but in places like China, where in the 40 million person strong Pearl River Delta around Guangzhou and Hong Kong and Macau, you have entirely electrified fleets of buses and trucks increasingly ramping forward. So there are a few ways to see this question. The Clean Air Act tells EPA to be technology forcing, which is to say it wants it to lead. Congress made a determination that public health matters. And the traditional framing on that is sort of a, economy versus environment framing. I guess I want to say, having designed these standards, is that's not right here. This is a question about both community justice and international economic competitiveness. We do not want to be in a place where these massive multinational trucking companies like Volvo and Daimler, which are both dragging their feet, sell EV trucks in Asia and Europe and sort of give us the dregs. We should be in a place where, especially as we're deploying IRA investments, we're building those trucks. Creating battery plant jobs, creating assembly jobs, and electrifying our freight system. And my concern is that the administration could miss the boat here. We really need an electric supply chain. Helps fight inflation, helps create jobs, helps free communities. And you can't do that if the EPA standard is basically behind the 8 ball or even kind of right at where progress is. EPA needs to be pushing. And that's what I really hope they'll do. They're certainly hearing from folks. I think we submitted like 20,000 petition signatures just this week, and I know other groups have done the same. But it's a listening question. I think a lot of folks would support strong action on this, including in 24. But the standard right now just doesn't quite meet the moment.
Thanks. This is really helpful. And I want to go back quickly to public health consequences, based somewhat on your comment, and then we can talk more about how to actually meet that outcome. So I wanted to note that heavy duty trucks, and don't quote me on these exact percentages as they may have changed a little bit, but they are increasingly responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, especially since the COVID pandemic has started, we've seen a rise in e-commerce. But they're even more disproportionately contributing to particulate matter and NOx pollution. So even though they're only about 10% of the vehicles on the road, I believe they're about 67% of particulate matter emissions from transportation, and somewhere around 50% of NOx emissions.
Mhm.
And so, Dr. Francis, I wanted to get your perspective on what some of the expected public health outcomes and benefits would be if we were able to actually get to 100% zero emission heavy duty trucks, or even start along that goal for medium duty or short haul heavy duty trucks that are concentrated in urban areas.
Okay, sure. Thank you for that question. So transitioning heavy-duty trucks to electric or zero-emission vehicles can have a number of significant public health outcomes, particularly as it goes to reducing air pollution-related health issues. But here are just a few of some of the expected health benefits. So first, obviously, would have decreased air pollution. Given, as you share, heavy-duty trucks are a significant source of pollution, emitting a number of different types of pollutants. Switching over to electric or zero emissions vehicles would substantially reduce emissions, thereby leading to improved air quality. And so this can decrease respiratory problems and issues such as asthma, bronchitis, and lower the risk of heart disease and lung cancer. That's one part of the equation. So then also another benefit would be lowering respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. So improved air quality due to reduced emissions from heavy-duty trucks can significantly reduce the respiratory diseases, as well as this would particularly benefit populations that are living near, next to, or adjacent to roadways in urban areas with high traffic. Reduced noise pollution is also a significant benefit. So electric trucks, quiet, they produce less noise compared to diesel trucks, and that leads to benefits in terms of reducing noise pollution and the related stress that's related to that. So when you start thinking about accelerating those positive public health outcomes, they can be achieved through a number of different strategies. And I'll just touch on maybe 3 of those strategies. So obviously we're talking about stricter clean transportation rules. And so that's part of the equation. So governments can obviously implement different incentives such as tax credits, subsidies, and other grants that will really help encourage the adoption of this type of vehicle. And additionally, obviously, we're talking about implementing stricter emission standards. In implementing those stricter standards, or regulations can also obviously drive the transition more quickly and rapidly. Also, another piece of this conversation in terms of accelerating this transition has to do with investment in infrastructure. So developing a robust charging or refueling infrastructure for electric and alternative fuel vehicles is really critical. Governments and private entities really need to invest in building this infrastructure to support the widespread adoption of clean energy trucks. One of the projects that we work on is the Mid-Atlantic Electrification Project, and we're electrifying a whole corridor between Virginia, Maryland, West Virginia, and the District of Columbia. And so one of our partners, Chesapeake Bay Authority, they're really embracing electrification, but some of the issues that they run into around accelerating their transition has to do with like supply chain, not being able to deploy their drayage trucks in a timely manner. So, I mean, those are some of the barriers I think that we're kind of reducing. And then another very important piece of this is doing education about the public health benefits, about the financial benefits as well, increasing awareness about the health implications of having heavy duty truck emissions and having heavy duty trucks in your transportation corridors and around communities. That can help garner support and really accelerate the shift. And then finally, the collaboration among those communities and residents that are adjacent to these transportation corridors is really critically important. So not only collaborating with government, industry, researchers, really collaborating and connecting in an authentic and meaningful way with those community members is really going to be essential for effective planning, resource allocation, implementation of policies that are aimed at really accelerating this transition.
Thank you so much. I have several follow-up questions. The first one is I'm gonna transition to Trisha here. And thank you so much for touching on like the challenges and barriers for deploying these technologies, especially charging infrastructure. So, Trisha, I was wondering if you could tell us, based on your membership and what you've seen with the companies that are members of CalSTART, what is the current reality of available technology for electric trucks and fuel cell trucks? And then what is lacking in infrastructure in order for those companies to be able to fully deploy?
Yeah, and I kind of like to lean in on a little bit more of the hopeful story around this. I feel like we're always hearing, the opposition is very loud in noting that the infrastructure is not available. But when you actually tune in, and I think the forum example is a good example, and start talking to the folks who are deploying the infrastructure, especially around what we call the charging as a service or the electric truck as a service model, there are billions of investments being made in these companies to ensure that the infrastructure will be available. What you hear often is, we just need the trucks. There's no shortness of investments that are being made. And like I said earlier, the bulk of, the bulk of the investments are being made in those ACT states. There's the market times around infrastructure being a barrier. One of the things that CalSTART did and helping to kind of deploy some of this anxiety is to show through our CalSTART's phasing in U.S. charging infrastructure report, which is basically a roadmap that shows that this is a phased-in approach, and that we don't need all the infrastructure everywhere all at once to meet even the EPA's preferred option of the rule, but even the ACT more stronger of the options, that it is a phased-in approach, meaning that the investments in charging infrastructure should be made in those what we call hubs or nodes, speaking specifically of your ports, where the collection of the trucks go to load and offload their oh my gosh, their loads. And so ensuring that those corridors and the hubs and the nodes are what is prioritized is really critical. And so to that, looking at the different investments that are coming out of the pipeline from IRA and BIL, ensuring that those investments are being made in this in the areas where we are going to see the most opportunity for electrifying. On top of that, I think there's many of us that have seen the Amazon EV delivery vans, or we're looking at UPS or FedEx, the middle mile, the ones that have fixed routes. Those are the easiest to deploy, right? They have a depot where they go back and charge. They have a number of miles that they do every day. They have a fixed schedule. So focusing in on that sector, much of which is being deployed even without this federal, market signal that we're looking for from the EPA. Those are the areas that are going to be the easiest to invest in, and the more that we can, I think, take the focus away from, oh, this can't be done because the Class 8, the long hauls are the harder to deploy in this, or to transition to EVs, and focus on what is feasible around the medium and heavy duty sector, the medium sector of these, kind of the ones that have the fixer out. This becomes a much more positive story, right, of something that is feasible, something that is tangible. So I become really hopeful in talking to a lot of our members who are currently doing the work, deploying the infrastructure and then deploying the trucks to go with it. Just before we got on this webinar, one of our members, DHL, announced, that they are deploying Class 8 trucks. So as we talk about how difficult this sector is to transition, the work is being made and the investments are happening.
Yeah, if I could just chime in on that for a second. I mean, I think that's a really good point. There tends to be a lot of this sort of doomsaying on what is in fact not that hard a problem. I mean, the technology is present. There are hundreds of available models in various stages of development across the truck classes. And there's really significant funding, both federally and state, to do this. And there's lots of folks who are interested in it, right? So if you're a utility, this is new load. That's great. That's a chance to move forward. If you're a port, this helps you meet clean air commitments. And if you're any form of business operator, the total cost of ownership for these trucks in a few years is almost certainly cheaper than that of constantly paying for diesel fuel. So a lot of the frame here, this is just so hard. I mean, one, you don't need that much infrastructure to start. The trucks are concentrated. They're concentrated in a few US ports and corridors, as CalSTAR has shown and as ICCT has also said. So that doesn't seem insuperable. There's major private interest in this, and with a strong standard, you get those investments on the back end. But on the front end, these are just really good vehicles. And part of what we're fighting over is whether or not people would like to not have fuel costs and have trucks that last about maybe as much as twice as long, given how few moving parts they have. That's a pretty easy proposition. So yeah, I think there's a lot of amplification of early stage hiccups. It's hard to build this charger, this particular truck model in beta to perform as expected. That's sort of to be anticipated. But when we're talking about a standard that extends out for more than a decade, I mean, I don't want to be flip about this, but you look at, say, computers or light duty EVs or phones, we're actually really good at this, both as a country and and this industry. And so I always find it a little bit depressing that you see the huge climate and public health needs that one can meet here. Then when people are like, I don't know, this one early stage model might not work. Well, maybe not. But over a decade, with a little bit of work, can America, put some electric trucks on roads that are already electrifying with technologies we know? Absolutely. And will both drivers and fleet operators really like that? Yeah. So, in a lot of ways, this is like trying to overcome this early stage hump with some companies trying to get a little more money out of their combustion fleet and some, fleet operators who still have cold feet because they don't know how good this is going to be, which is why, EPA leadership matters here. But the future we could have is a really good one. It just requires like actually charting it out.
You put the question in my mouth rather, and you answered what I was going to ask you. So I really appreciate your perspective there. And I also wanted to mention, I spoke to Adam from Forum earlier today, and he mentioned the same thing, that in their experience, the infrastructure is somewhat being scapegoated right now. And the problem that they're really experiencing is the cost of the trucks, but that they expect that to correct itself as technology matures and the market expands. We don't have too much more time left, so I just wanted to ask a couple more questions. So Trisha, I'll go back to you. You've touched on this a little bit, but I want to know what policies you would like to see implemented at the federal level to expand the options for those technologies that are used in electric heavy duty transportation. And then I'm going to go to Dr. Francis again. You touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to know if you had more about how we can bring in local communities in this transition to electric trucking, both in terms of workforce development for the truck drivers, but also in the planning process as we're building out the chargers and the infrastructure for those technologies.
Great. So I'll go first and then pass it over to Dr. Shelley Francis, and we just have a few more minutes, so I'll try to make this quick. But I think I'm a broken record on this one, but it's just so critical, is that, a strong federal standard will drive the transition and will provide the market signal. So first and foremost, as Craig noted, we need to get this rule across the finish line, and we need to do it quickly to ensure that, the truck manufacturers and the companies have the time to realize, and meet the goals that are within the proposal. And then second, talking about the investments through IRA and BIL, I'll just note, some of those are still on the horizon. So the sooner that we can get out the guidance that comes with, say, 45W, which is the Commercial Clean Vehicles Credit, and provides $45,000 for heavy duty trucks, or, the CFI grants, the more that we can speed up those investments that are already in the horizon that we know have already passed. Putting forward the Clean Ports Program, which I think will be critical in providing incentives and hopefully a voucher incentive program to help electrify the vehicles in the ports, or the heavy duty vehicle program. The more that we can realize these investments, the quicker that we can meet a strong role. So I think the government, the administration has done tremendous work to get us to this point. Now we just need, a real push to ensure that they are being implemented with speediness that we need here. But I'll yield my time and send it over to Dr. Shelley Francis.
Thanks so much, Trisha. So I would say to engage, to engage communities as part of this conversation around workforce development as well as infrastructure. It's really going to be critical that we establish, specialized training programs or apprenticeships catering to those who are living in those port adjacent communities or those communities where there's heavy industry there by the transportation corridors. So really helping prepare them for that next workforce related to electric trucking, fostering employment opportunities within the community will be really important. In parallel, I will also say that involving community members in that planning process for charging infrastructure is really going to be critical. Also initiating these open dialogue opportunities through town halls, or maybe it's planning meetings or surveys, but a combination of both low technology and high technology methods will be really important so that residents can voice their opinions and preferences, share their concerns and recommendations as to, where optimal charging sites might be or optimal programs might look like that will help reduce their exposure to transportation emissions from heavy duty vehicles. This type of participatory approach really ensures that the infrastructure and the strategy aligns with both the community's unique requirements and circumstances, and then also maximizes accessibility. And then the last two things would be around collaborating with like local institutions, educational institutions specifically, workforce development agencies, community organizations that can help really facilitate targeted outreach and recruitment efforts. So holding job fairs, workshops, educational campaigns that really help enlighten residents about the benefits of transitioning to electric trucking, while also highlighting potential career paths, entrepreneurship opportunities, really helps encourage local participation and will help support that transition. So ultimately what you're trying to do is seek sustained continuous engagement opportunities from the community, get their community input, buy-in, and foster effective partnerships between these stakeholders that will fundamentally be critical for a successful integration of local communities into this shift to accelerate electric transportation in their communities.
Thanks so much. That's really helpful information. We have 2 minutes. We had a really thoughtful question in the chat. I see Craig answered it in the chat, but for the recording purposes and our audience that's listening, I would love to just get maybe like a 30-second answer from anyone who wants to answer it, which is, the question is, the Biden administration seems to be hesitant to finalize a strong version of the phase 3 rule. What can supporters or advocates do to drive support for the strongest proposed version of the rule? And maybe we'll start with Craig, since you answered in the chat, and then go around.
This is about politics at this stage. I mean, people just need to contact the White House to rally communities, to contact champions on the Hill like Senator Carper and Padilla and White House and Markey, all of whom have been pushing this along with like 80 other members of Congress. To say they need this. This is important. And I would call back the president and Administrator Regan to their core commitments. They've said they want to leave no stone unturned on environmental justice, and they want to put forward an American electric vehicle industry. Well, here's their chance. This is their moment. And I think people need to remind them that they have support to seize the opportunity in front of them.
And I'll just add, I think what we've been doing at CalSTART is just, amplifying the voices of those who are doing the work. So the charging as a service, e-trucks as a service, utilities, the infrastructure providers, the more that they can request that this rule be finalized, the more confidence that we're giving the White House and the EPA to get this over the finish line.
Yep, and I would just add in, our stance has been, and on our advocacy arm with our nonprofit, is really making sure that people have access to information on how to relay their concerns to the current administration. They say they want to hear from folks and from us, so let's bombard them with our feedback. And so just really creating those clear pathways and opportunities for how they communicate with their legislators or the current administration really is a way for folks to kind of target that information and that feedback.
Thanks. I think all of those are really great advice. We're out of time, so I want to thank our speakers for making the time to join us and sharing their expertise, and all of our attendees. We appreciate the time you've taken to listen to this. A recording of this will be posted on our website, so feel free to share that once it's posted. If you're interested in learning more about what ITD is doing, please subscribe to our newsletter. We'll announce any more of these webinars that we have. And we are also hosting a 1-year anniversary event the week of TRB. If folks are going to be in DC, we would love if you would join us on January 9th at Busboys and Poets for breakfast. Please join us to celebrate. There will be food served and a discussion of a lot of the work that we've done across the transportation sector, featuring some of our grant recipients and partners. And I will leave it there, and thank you again all for your time, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Fleming. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Fleming and Kirsty and Tricia and the audience.
Bye, everybody.
Okay, thank you.